The sun beat down on the Texas plains, unrelenting, shimmering waves of heat rising from the dusty ground. A group of weary German prisoners stepped off the back of a U.S. Army truck, their boots crunching against dry gravel. These men, captured on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe, had braced themselves for barbed wire, guard towers, and endless punishment. Instead, what they found was cattle. A ranch foreman in a wide-brimmed hat strode toward them, a lasso slung casually over one shoulder. He tipped his hat and, through a translator, delivered a message that left the PS stunned. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch, fence mending, cattle drives, whatever needs doing." The Germans exchanged glances of disbelief. These were men who had fought under the swastika, who had endured desert battles, tank engagements, and bombing raids. And now here in Texas, their new battlefield was the open range. Instead of machine guns, they were handed work gloves. Instead of shouting sergeants, they were guided by soft-spoken cowboys who measured a man, not by ideology, but by how well he could wrangle a steer. One young prisoner, barely 20, stared out at the endless horizon. The land stretched on, forever, bigger than anything he had seen in Europe. Another P whispered in disbelief. "This isn't imprisonment. This is another life." Within days they were riding in the backs of pickup trucks, trailing herds under the blazing sun, watching cowboys whistle and call to the animals as if it were second nature. They were paid in canteen tokens, given hearty meals, and even allowed moments of freedom unthinkable in a time of war. For these German soldiers, Texas was not just captivity. It was culture shock, a collision between the old world and the Wild West. And as they adjusted to cowboy life, many of them began to realize something shocking. The Americans were not the brutal enemies Nazi propaganda had promised. They were ranchers, farmers, and neighbors, men who needed hands, not hatred. What began as disbelief would soon become one of the most unusual stories of World War II. For the German soldiers who had been captured in North Africa or Italy, the journey to America was filled with dread. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a land of chaos, lawlessness, and cruelty. They expected brutal camps, starvation, and humiliation at the hands of their captors. Instead, as the troop ships reached the port of Houston or Galveston, and the PS were loaded onto trains bound for the Texas interior, they began to see something entirely different. Through the barred train windows stretched fields of wheat, endless ranch land, and towns that looked almost untouched by war. Children played in yards. Shopkeepers tipped their hats. And the prisoners realized that America was not burning under bombs the way Germany was. Still, fear lingered. Many of the men whispered to each other in hushed tones. Would they be beaten? Would they be executed? The Geneva Convention had been mentioned, but who could trust the promises of the enemy? When the trains stopped near the dusty towns of Central and West Texas, the prisoners expected barbed wire and armed guards. Yes, the camps were fenced and patrolled. But what shocked them was what lay outside the wire. Ranch land stretching for miles, filled with cattle that needed tending. On their first day of assignment, many PS could hardly believe it. The cowboys who greeted them weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were ordinary men in jeans, boots, and sans. Men who had spent their entire lives under the wide Texas sky. They carried ropes, rifles, and spoke with an easy drawl that baffled the Germans at first. Prisoner Heinrich Keller later recalled in a memoir, "We were certain we would be treated like animals. Instead, they treated us like farmhands who simply spoke another language." It was humiliating and liberating at the same time. The misconception ran both ways. Many Texans raised on wartime posters and newsreels expected the German PSWs to be fanatics, rabid Nazis who might lash out at any moment. But what they saw stepping off those trucks were thin, tired young men, more farm boys than soldiers. They were shocked at how polite, even differential, many of the Germans were when faced with honest. The collision of expectations created an atmosphere of uncertainty at first. The Germans didn't know whether to resist or comply. The Texans didn't know if their new workers could be trusted. But the land itself demanded answers. Fences had to be fixed. Cattle had to be driven. The rhythm of ranch life would break down the barriers faster than speeches or orders ever could. And so began one of the strangest chapters of the war. German POWs once trained to kill Americans now herring their cattle under the Texas sun. By 1943, America faced a logistical problem that few could have anticipated at the start of the war. What to do with the massive influx of German prisoners? From the deserts of Tunisia to the fields of Sicily, Allied armies were capturing tens of thousands of Axis soldiers. Britain was already overcrowded with POWs. Its resources stretched thin. The solution was clear. Ship them across the Atlantic, far from the front lines, to a place with plenty of land, food, and Texas, with its wide open spaces and agricultural economy, became one of the primary destinations. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 German POWs were held across the Lone Star State, spread among dozens of camps. The largest facilities like Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Swift were built to handle thousands of men. Smaller branch camps were scattered across ranches and farms, housing dozens to hundreds at a time. These camps were not the barbed wire nightmares the Germans had feared. Yes, there were guard towers and fences, but they were constructed under the rules of the Geneva Convention. POWs had to be provided adequate shelter, food, medical care, and even opportunities for recreation. In practice, many of these camps offered better conditions than what German soldiers had experienced at the front. Prisoners were often stunned to receive plentiful meals, including meat, vegetables, and bread, while their families back in Germany survived on rationed turnips and sawdust bread. But the most surprising aspect of their captivity was work. The United States faced a severe labor shortage during the war with millions of American men overseas. Farms and ranches struggled to keep up production. Congress authorized POW labor and the Army struck agreements with local farmers and ranchers. Prisoners could be hired out for agricultural work with wages paid to the U.S. government. In exchange, POWs received small allowances for use in camp cantons. For Texans, this was a win-win. They desperately needed hands to harvest cotton, cut sugarcane, and in the wide cattle country help with ranch duties. For German prisoners, it was a bewildering turn of events. One day, they were fighting under Rommel in North Africa. The next they were riding in a flatbed truck to mend fences in West Texas. The sight of German soldiers working the land became almost routine. Across rural Texas, locals watched them fixing irrigation ditches, carrying hay, bales, or driving cattle under the watchful eye of a handful of armed guards. What astonished many Texans was how quickly the prisoners adapted. Some POWs had grown up on German farms, familiar with livestock and heavy labor. They proved competent workers and often outpaced expectations. Cowboys were amused to see young Germans who had once trained with rifles now sweating in the Texas sun, learning to swing lassos or drive stubborn steers across pastures. The initial mistrust began to fade as both sides realized they shared something in common, a bond with the land and a respect for hard. Still, there were cultural clashes. Germans were disciplined, accustomed to strict schedules and command structures. Ranch life, by contrast, was loose, pragmatic, and shaped by the needs of the moment. One cowboy later recalled with a grin, "Those Germans would line up their tools like it was the army. Out here, we just grab what works and get the job done." The background of these POW camps reveals a paradox. the United States had taken its enemy soldiers and instead of treating them as dangerous captives, had turned them into an unexpected labor force. Texas ranchers saw them less as Nazis and more as able-bodied young men who could help keep cattle moving and crops growing. For the Germans, captivity in Texas was their first unfiltered glimpse of America. It wasn't the land of chaos and decay their leaders had described. It was a nation of vast land, endless cattle, and ordinary men who valued sweat more than slogans. The stage was set for lessons no propaganda could erase. Numbers told a story the German POWs could not ignore. In Europe, they had been taught that Germany was the pinnacle of discipline and organization, that their Reich had the resources and resolve to outlast any foe. But Texas forced them to confront a different kind of arithmetic, one measured not in tanks or rifles, but in cattle herds, acres of farmland, and the sheer scale of American abundance. Start with the labor shortage. By 1944, over 12 million American men were serving in uniform. Texas ranches, already sprawling and labor-intensive, were left with gaping holes in their workforce. German POWs filled those gaps. Nearly 50,000 Germans in Texas alone logged millions of man-hour in agriculture. Across the United States, labor provided the equivalent of more than 36,000 full-time workers. An invisible army keeping American food and raw materials flowing, while the real army fought overseas. Then there was food. The average German soldier at the front received rations equivalent to 201,500 calories per day. By 1944, barely enough to survive heavy labor. Texas PS were shocked to find themselves fed on a 3,200-calorie daily ration, almost identical to that of U.S. troops. Meals often included beef, pork, bread, potatoes, and fresh vegetables. To men who had lived on black bread and watery soup, the abundance was surreal. Cattle told their own story. Texas ranches held an estimated 10 million head of cattle during the war years. The sheer scale of this livestock industry dwarfed what the Germans knew from Europe. 1P later wrote, in Bavaria, a large farm might keep 20 cows. Here, a single rancher counted his herd in the thousands. That realization carried a painful message. America had so much food that even its prisoners could be well fed while Germany's civilians starved. Money was another statistic of shock. PS earned 80 cents per day in credit for their labor, paid not to them directly, but to the U.S. Army, which in turn provided them canteen tokens. Those tokens, prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, soft drinks, and small luxuries. It was more spending power than many German civilians had at home in 1944, where inflation and shortages left store shelves bare. Perhaps the most devastating number of all, production. Many PS arrived in Texas in 1943–44, the very years when American factories were hitting peak output. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and over 8 million tons of shipping. German officers in captivity allowed to read. American newspapers realized with dread what those figures meant. Germany had built just 40,000 aircraft in the same year with dwindling fuel and pilot training. Even the ranches demonstrated production power on a scale the Germans could hardly fathom. Cotton harvests, wheat shipments, beef cattle drives, all were massive coordinated operations, carried out with tractors, trucks, and machinery that Germany simply could not match. For men raised in a country where farm work still relied heavily on horses and hand tools, Texas agriculture was an industrial operation in itself. These numbers cut deep. Each statistic revealed a painful truth. The Reich had promised them supremacy. But here in captivity they saw that America could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast them in every dimension. For the German PSWs. Working under the Texas sun, the math of defeat was no longer abstract. It was in the herds that stretched beyond the horizon, the meals piled high in mess halls, the pay tokens jingling in their pockets. It was in the undeniable arithmetic of abundance versus scarcity. Numbers don't lie. And in Texas, the numbers told them Germany could never win. The first time a group of German PS stepped onto a working Texas cattle ranch, they thought it was a trick. Prisoners expected armed drills, forced marches, or backbreaking punishment. Instead, they were handed shovels, fence posts, and feed sacks. The cowboy foreman gave them a demonstration, speaking in a slow drawl that most couldn't understand, then pointed at the tools and gestured toward a broken fence line. The message was clear. At first the Germans balked. They had fought for the Wehrmacht, worn the eagle on their uniforms, and now here, they were being asked to do the work of ranch hands. A few refused to touch the tools, insisting such labor was degrading. But hunger and boredom are powerful motivators. Within hours, most had picked up hammers and wire following the lead of the cowboys. It didn't take long for the disbelief to give way to grudging respect. Ranch life was brutally hard. The Texas sun was unforgiving, burning down on men who had grown up under the softer skies of Europe. The distances were vast. A short ride to check a herd could take hours across rough open land. And the cattle themselves were nothing like the Doxel dairy cows of Bavaria. Texas Longhorns were stubborn, massive, and sometimes dangerous, requiring skill and courage to control. One young P. named Dara wrote in his post-war diary, "I had fought in Tunisia, marched across Sicily, survived bombardments. Yet it was here in Texas, chasing cattle that could crush a man that I realized I was no longer a soldier, but something else entirely, a worker of the land." For the cowboys, the first days were just as strange. Many had lost brothers or sons in the war. They had expected German soldiers to be arrogant, maybe violent. Instead, what they saw were skinny young men, many barely in their 20s, sweating, fumbling with barbed wire, or struggling to lift heavy hay bales. They weren't Nazis. One cowboy later said, "They were just boys who got caught up in a war. Out here, work made us all the same." The PSWs quickly discovered that their captors treated them with a surprising level of humanity. If they worked hard, they were rewarded with decent meals. They were given water breaks, shade when the sun was high, and sometimes even a chance to share a laugh with the ranch. The cowboys joked that the Germans were free labor with accents, but some admitted privately that the men reminded them of themselves. By the end of their first week, the PWS had learned some basic ranching skills: how to mend fences with wire and posts, how to drive a herd across pasture, and how to haul feed sacks without spilling half of it. Their bodies act in ways the battlefield hadn't prepared them for. But they also began to sense something strange. These Americans didn't hate them. They were not treated as mortal enemies, but as men who could pull their weight. The first field test of this arrangement came during a cattle drive. The Germans were loaded into trucks and brought to open range where hundreds of cattle had to be moved into pens for branding. It was chaos at first. Cattle bolted in every direction. Dust filled the air and the PS stumbled over themselves trying to follow orders shouted in English. Cowboys rode horseback through the dust, swinging lassos with practiced ease. For the PS, it was a spectacle straight out of a Wild West movie. By the end of the day, though, they had contributed. Their hands were blistered, their uniforms soaked with sweat, but they had helped drive a herd into its pen. That night in camp over dinner, they talked about it in hushed voices. This was not captivity, as they had imagined. It was labor, yes, but it carried a strange dignity. The Germans had been sent to Texas as prisoners, but their first days on the ranch revealed something they hadn't expected. They were being turned into cowboys. The The P soon realized that ranch work was not just about fixing fences or wrangling cattle. It was a system, living machine, where every small task contributed to something far larger. They had been trained as soldiers to think in terms of orders and obedience, but Texas ranching taught them the math of survival in a different form. Take the fences. One broken post might seem trivial, but on a ranch it meant cattle straying, herds scattering, and days of wasted labor. Fixing one fence saved hours of chasing cows across miles of land. For men who had watched tanks break down from a missing part or supply lines collapse from a single bottleneck, the lesson was clear. Efficiency meant everything. Feeding the herds offered another revelation. A few sacks of grain dumped at the wrong time could cause cattle to stampede, injuring both animals and men. But done correctly at dawn in measured portions, the entire herd could be kept calm, fattened, and ready for market. It was a rhythm not unlike the precision of military drill, but driven by nature rather than command. And then there was water. Texas summers were merciless. Rivers running dry, ponds shrinking too. P.S. learned quickly that hauling water wasn't a chore. It was life itself. A miscalculation meant dead cattle, which meant lost income, which meant failure for the ranch. They began to see how American prosperity wasn't built only on factories and machines. It was built on an understanding of how to manage resources at scale. For German officers among the prisoners, these lessons were humiliating in their clarity. They had been told that Germany's discipline, willpower, and superior tactics would win the war. Yet here they were mending fences with American cowboys who understood instinctively the logistics of keeping thousands of cattle alive. The contrast was crushing. The math of collapse followed them into camp at night. A single guard armed with a rifle could oversee dozens of PS because the prisoners knew that escape was futile. The distances were too vast. The land too empty. A man could walk for days and find nothing but dust, cattle, and endless horizon. Many calculated in their heads, even if I escape, where would I go? How would I eat? The ranch itself acted as a prison without walls. But the most devastating realization was hidden in plain sight. If America could spare thousands of enemy soldiers to mend fences, drive herds, and harvest crops, then what did that say about the country's manpower? The PS knew that back home in Germany, civilians were being forced into war industries, old men and teenagers dragged into service. In Texas, America